Is anarchism a practical socio-economic system? How would a modern anarchist society function? Can such a society succeed inside a capitalist state? If you've ever considered these questions, you may be interested in this video, which is the first of two videos describing the 18-year history and success of Smangus, an indigenous Christian anarchist community in Taiwan. This video will cover these topics. First, where to find reliable sources of information on Smangus. Secondly, the history of Christianity in Taiwan. Thirdly, the origin of the modern Smangus community. Fourthly, Smangus' adoption of Christian anarchism. Reliable sources on Smangus. This video is based very largely on the book entitled Smangus, written by Hui Ichie, Director of the Education and Culture Department of Smangus Tribal Council. This is the best primary source for the history and development of Smangus. However, the book's bilingual text, written in Taya and Chinese, will be unreadable for most people. Various academic journal articles, mostly published in Taiwan, some written in Chinese, provide a scholarly treatment of Smangus from a range of perspectives, such as environmental sustainability, indigenous culture studies, and intentional communities. These resources are reasonably accessible and reliably well researched, but typically have a very narrow focus. The most common and readily available sources of information on Smangus, in both English and Chinese, are travel guides and ecotourism commentaries. Most of these repeat the same information, which has usually originated from the Taiwan government or from personal visits by journalists and travellers. However, this information is at least typically accurate, even if it isn't very detailed. See the video description for a list of recommended information sources. History of Christianity in Taiwan. In order to understand the anarchism of Smangus, we must understand its Christianity. Smangus is an anarchist community because it is a Christian community. Its anarchism was derived from its Christian ethic. Of course, since Smangus is an indigenous community, it was not originally Christian. Consequently, understanding Smangus as an anarchist community requires an understanding of how and why it became Christian, and to do that, we need to start with the history of Christianity in Taiwan. In 1624, the Dutch East India Company established a military outpost, Fort Provincia, in the south of Taiwan. Although some attempts were made to colonize the island, including military oppression of the indigenous people and the establishment of a rudimentary government administration, trading posts, and an education system, the Dutch military presence was too small and weak to hold more than a third of Taiwan's territory. The Dutch fought with an even smaller Spanish outpost in the north of Taiwan, which the Spanish abandoned in 1642. The Dutch were almost completely unsuccessful in their attempts to preach Christianity in Taiwan. Shi Yitan, lecturer of the University of London, notes that by 1650 the Dutch had recorded only 5,900 conversions to Christianity, many of which were of indigenous people. After just under 40 years of a precarious existence, the Dutch presence in Taiwan was forced out by Guo Xingye, also known as Guo Xing'er, a warlord from China who invaded Taiwan in 1661 as part of the Ming dynasty's imperialist expansion. Christianity was suppressed harshly under his rule. Professor Anne Halen of National Taiwan Normal University writes, quote, Guo Xing'er treated the Dutch missionaries, schoolmasters, and their native converts with peculiar severity, end quote. In time, Taiwan was invaded again, this time by the armies of China's imperialist Qing dynasty, and Christianity remained suppressed. A small wave of English, Canadian, and Spanish Christian missionaries arrived in the 19th century, but made little progress despite some conversions. From 1895 to 1945, Taiwan was colonized brutally by the Japanese, who also ensured Christianity was totally suppressed. As a result, by the mid-20th century, Christianity had made virtually no progress in Taiwan over the last 300 years, and had almost no impact on the local culture. However, this situation changed significantly after 1945. Ironically, the most influential wave of Christian missionaries did not come from the West. They arrived as Han Chinese Christians from China. In 1945, General Chiang Kai-shek, or Jiang Zhongzheng, of the Nationalist Kuomintang Party, lost control of China to the Communists and invaded Taiwan, which he established as a base of operations with the aim of one day returning to retake China. Zhi Yitan says that, quote, during this decade there was a surge in evangelical activity, end quote, explaining that European missionaries also started arriving again. Tan further writes, quote, after the 1950s, entire Aboriginal villages took up the faith, following the strategic conversions of village leaders, end quote. Of all the various indigenous tribes in Taiwan, it was the Atayal people who accepted it most enthusiastically, and even today around 90% of Atayal are at least nominally Christian. This establishes the background to the origins of Smangus, a modern Atayal Christian anarchist community. The Atayal people, called Dayan in their own dialects and Taiya in Chinese, are divided roughly into the plains-dwelling tribes and the mountain-dwelling tribes. Those in the mountains have typically survived by hunting game and harvesting small crops of millet, sweet potatoes, and mushrooms. Although Christianity was a religious import, it has been adopted by Taiwan's indigenous people and incorporated into their own culture. Rather than indigenous people becoming Western-style Christians, Christianity in Taiwan's indigenous communities has become localized and transculturated. As Taiwan was taken over by the Han Chinese from 1945 onwards, indigenous people who converted to Christianity began to use their faith to differentiate themselves from the Han Chinese, and applying it as an additional social buffer to resist assimilation into Chinese culture. Professor Xie Shizhong, an anthropologist at National Taiwan University, writes, quote, that is, Christianity stands as a symbol of power introduced from Western civilization that indigenous peoples appropriated in order to cope with the continuous impact of Han Chinese civilization, end quote. This appropriation of Christianity by indigenous people in Taiwan to strengthen their own identity and culture stands in contrast to the typical historical pattern of Christianity as an exogenous religious force imposed on local cultures, which it deforms and erodes. Origin of modern Smangus. The modern history of Smangus Galang, called Sima Ku Si in Chinese, begins in the 1970s. For the benefit of anyone listening to but not viewing this video, please note that in this next section I will be relying partly on the brief summary of Smangus development written by journalist Angela Lu Fulton in an article for The World magazine published in May 2019. Most of the information will come from other sources that I will cite directly, such as the book Smangus, written by Lahui Jie, director of the Education and Culture Department of Smangus Tribal Council, as well as various academic works. This section is quite lengthy, but it's important because it explains the motivation behind Smangus' eventual adoption of anarchism. However, if you'd rather skip this part of the village's history, use the timestamps in the video description to jump to the next section, which describes the way in which Smangus implemented Christian anarchism. There are several different Dayan tribal lineages and dialects. The people of Smangus belong to the Dayan Marakwang lineage and speak the Skuliak dialect. For decades, their mountain village, 1,500 meters above sea level, was without electricity, a phone service, or a main access road. Even now, it is one of Taiwan's most remote indigenous settlements. The village's economy consisted almost entirely of traditional mushroom farming using techniques introduced by the Japanese colonizers. Aided by US financial investment, Taiwan was one of the top mushroom producers in the world at this time, ensuring the village a modest but stable income. This started to change in 1979, when the village finally received an electricity service. However, modernization came at a price. Like many other indigenous communities at the time, as it became more connected with the outside world, Smangus found more of its young people leaving the village to seek higher education and better employment opportunities elsewhere, typically in the small towns and cities at the foot of the mountains. During this time, the global mushroom price fell as Korea and China competed for position in the market. When its mushroom industry lost value and its income fell, Smangus was severely depopulated by families moving out of the village, to the point that only 8 families remained. At this point, a new revenue source was clearly needed, and the villagers started to consider participating in Taiwan's robust ecotourism industry, which was becoming particularly popular among indigenous communities. It may seem surprising, but ecotourism was a new idea for the village. Contrary to popular belief, Taiwan's indigenous people do not always live harmoniously with their environment. In fact, exploitation and unsustainable land and harvesting practices are not uncommon. Even in Smangus, the villagers had become accustomed to treating their environment with some degree of disregard. In an article in the Taiwanese newspaper Taipei Times, published on the 8th of November 2004, just after the formation of Smangus as an anarchist community, local Smangus resident Tocqueville Ijian mentioned that his father, quote, had killed or captured 20-odd bears before he died, end quote. It should be noted that such exploitative behavior is contrary to the Dayan people's traditional gaga, the tribal mores and ethical principles which govern individual behavior, in particular such activities as hunting. Tocqueville Ijian added that he interpreted his father's death from a fall in the mountains as a punishment for his exploitative hunting of the bears, saying, quote, "We believe those bears killed by my father avenged their death," end quote. In the same article, Taiwanese writer Wu Qiqing spoke of the casual way villagers killed local wildlife during his visit to Smangus in 1989, saying, quote, "When I first visited Smangus 15 years ago, Atayal people shot birds to treat me," end quote. He went on to say, quote, "I told them if they wanted to attract more visitors to this remote village, they had to protect wild animals," end quote. Tension remains today between government attempts to preserve endangered species and indigenous determination to continue traditional hunting practices. In the last couple of centuries, animals such as the Formosan deer and Formosan clouded leopard were hunted to the brink of extinction by indigenous people, and some of these animals are still hunted today by local tribes. While Taiwan's Wildlife Conservation Act of 2016 states, quote, "Wildlife may be hunted or killed for traditional cultural or ritual hunting, killing, or utilization needs of Taiwan Aborigines," end quote, it lays down specific conditions under which this can take place, conditions which indigenous hunters can be prone to disregard. However, there are still indigenous hunters who predominantly use traditional methods of hunting, such as snares and bows and arrows, and follow strictly their tribe's restrictions on hunting behavior. The year 1991 was a pivotal moment in Smangus history. Village leader Ijie Sulung had a dream in which he believed God said he would send many people to the village to restore its fortunes. Interpreting this as a divine confirmation that Smangus was to restart its economy on the basis of ecotourism, Ijie investigated the area's potential and discovered a nearby grove of giant cypress trees. Over the next couple of years, Smangus revived its economy by marketing itself to tourists as an exotic, isolated mountain village with unique environmental assets. At this early stage, Smangus tourism promotion capitalized extensively on its indigenous identity, promoting the village as an exotic and otherworldly location untouched by modernization and offering an experience with ancient primitivism. Somewhat ironically, the villagers made extensive use of historic stereotypes of indigenous people in their advertising. A paper on tourism development in impoverished communities by Dr. Benxiang Zheng notes that at this time, leaders in Smangus deliberately marketed the village to tourists with terms such as dark tribe, Xanadu, last pure land, primitive, and misty mountain. Whether this should be described as cynical or simply practical is a matter of personal opinion. Regardless, this strategy proved enormously financially successful, though it came at a social cost. After a main access road was finally built in 1995, Smangus found itself overrun by tourist traffic well beyond the capacity of its infrastructure. In a book on biodiversity conservation in China and Taiwan, Dr. Gerald Beath and Dr. Leng Zigang note that during the Chinese New Year holiday in 1997, quote, 1,200 tourists in 500 vehicles entered Smangus, end quote. Beath and Leng described the tourists' impact as overwhelmingly negative, saying they, quote, carved initials on the cypress trees, invaded village plots and homes, and left piles of garbage." End quote. In addition to tourist management challenges, internal conflicts also arose. Dr. Ben Qiangzeng notes that opportunities to participate in the tourist economy were unevenly spread throughout the village. Families with more land were able to provide more services and thus secure a greater share of income, while villages with fewer assets to convert into tourist attractions were financially disadvantaged. Competition for tourist dollars caused interpersonal tensions. Zeng also describes how the attraction of tourist income led some households to, quote, develop extra activities in the forest and or to build more lodgings, many of which were unlawful, improperly designed or planned, and less safe, end quote. As Smangus became a well-known tourist attraction, it also became a tempting prize for developers looking for their next opportunity for the exploitation and capitalization of rural land. However, despite being offered huge cash incentives, village leader Ijie Zulung refused to sell any of the land, insisting that it had been given to the tribe by God and was the rightful inheritance of the following generations. Organized crime gangs also attempted to obtain land through both bribes and threats, but were also rebuffed strongly. Although Smangus was enjoying financial security, its prosperity was unevenly distributed throughout the village. It was vulnerable to external pressure, and it was suffering from internal tensions. At this point, village elders took the initiative to propose a radical restructuring of the entire community. Smangus adopts Christian anarchism. By the late 1990s, tribal leader Ijie Zulung had already been suggesting the idea that Smangus economic assets be redistributed to a cooperative organization and owned collectively by all the villagers. This proposal gradually gathered sufficient momentum to prompt action at the turn of the millennium. However, Ijie's motivation was not simply economic. He was convinced that the disharmony in Smangus had a deeper cause, both ethical and spiritual. The villagers' sudden access to wealth had incited materialistic desire, and the unequal distribution of that wealth had engendered envy, jealousy, and division. As a Christian, Ijie would have recalled to mind various relevant passages from the New Testament, such as 1 Timothy 6 verse 10, which reads, quote, "Those who long to be rich, however, stumble into temptation and a trap and many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is the root of all evils." End quote. A number of other villagers agreed with Ijie. A paper by Drs. Guangjie Hong and Chunjiang Lin, examining the intersection of culture and ecotourism at Smangus, comments on the village's situation at this time, writing, quote, "From the residents' point of view, the problems of the tourist management were actually religious problems," end quote, adding that the villagers saw their local church as the key to resolving their internal conflict. But this response was not a matter of simply exhorting people to Christian charity or making pious speeches about the importance of spiritual virtues. Tribal leader Ijie Zulung decided that the village should go beyond the idea of just starting a cooperative business and restructure the entire community of Smangus, taking direct inspiration from the socio-economic organization of the original 1st century Christians. In her article on Smangus, journalist Angela Lu Fulton cites village elder Yurao Ijiang, who, quote, remembers all-night meetings where they discussed creating a communal system based on the early church in Acts 2, end quote. That's talking about a passage in the Bible. The book of Acts is the 5th book in the New Testament, and the end of the 2nd chapter contains a description of the earliest Christian community. Acts chapter 2 verses 44 to 45 reads thus, quote, "All who believed were together and held everything in common, and they began selling their property and possessions and distributing the proceeds to everyone as anyone had need." End quote. This is an explicit description of a Christian collectivist community with common ownership of property and egalitarian provision for the needs of all its members. Citing this passage in her article, Anarchy, Foundations in Faith, Professor Lisa Kemmerer says, quote, the book of Acts portrays early Christian communities as communal, like the ideal anarchist communities described by Berkman, Proudhon, and Chomsky, end quote. In his work Demanding the Impossible, A History of Anarchism, published in 2008, Dr. Peter Marshall likewise cites Acts 2, commenting, quote, "There are solid grounds for believing that the first Christian believers practiced a form of communism and usufruct. The account in Acts is explicit," end quote. Another New Testament passage in the same book, Acts chapter 4, verse 32, repeats this description of the earliest Christian community, saying, quote, "The group of those who believed were of one heart and mind, and no one said that any of his possessions was his own, but everything was held in common," end quote. In his book, All Things in Common, The Economic Practices of the Early Christians, published in 2017, Roman Montero says, quote, "What Luke seems to imply by writing, 'and no one claimed private ownership of any possessions' in Acts 4:32, is that this was taken literally," end quote, adding, quote, "The Christians really did treat property as though it really was common, and no one claimed ownership over their own property," end quote. Montero goes on to describe this as, quote, "a community that looks exactly like communism in the classic Marxist sense of the word, where all property is owned collectively without actually having collective property," end quote. There are at least 1,500 different cooperative businesses in Taiwan, in fields such as finance and banking, consumption, public utilities, and agriculture, so the residents of Smangus had plenty of local examples of successful co-ops which they could have imitated. However, their inspiration was not secular, but explicitly Christian. They sought a solution which would reintegrate their community on the basis of their shared religious and spiritual beliefs, and consequently turned to a successful historical model which was representative of their faith and true to their scriptures. The extent to which their organizational structure is best described as anarchism, as opposed to communalism, mutualism, collectivism, or something else, is certainly a matter for discussion, and will be covered in the second video in this series. For now, let's continue with the narrative of their decision and how it was implemented. La Hui Yijie records that, quote, "In 2001, a total of 16 couples from 8 families formed a joint management group," end quote, and that by 2003, quote, "most of the tribe's members were participating in the collective management group," end quote. Providing more detail, Dr. Ben Changzeng writes that, quote, "In 2001, a communal operations system emerged," end quote, during which time, quote, "the community established the Association for Development of Atayal Smangus and Kalang," end quote. Writing for Taiwan Panorama magazine, journalist Oscar Chung says that in 2001, the villagers, quote, "began cooperatively supplying food and beverage services to tourist visitors, sharing the income among everyone involved," end quote, noting that in the next year, quote, "this concept was extended to accommodation," end quote. The transformation of Smangus into a Christian anarchist community was further advanced in late 2003, during which time La Hui Yijie writes that 9 tribal representatives traveled to a kibbutz in Israel to study an active model of collectivism. La Hui says, quote, "After returning home, they continued to hold intense discussions over how to collectivize the village's privately held land," end quote. On the 14th of September 2003, further discussions were held on the topic of land ownership, and representatives of various households signed up to an agreement on land and property collectivization. Discussions of how to implement the new land ownership system continued to the 5th of January 2004, at which point a new organization was formed named Deno Nan, the Taiyan name for weaving. By this time, La Hui writes, 7 village members had originally joined but later withdrawn. At this point, there were now 48 salaried individuals in the collective, and its organization was becoming increasingly well developed. The next video in this series will describe in detail how the Smangus community was organized, how it operates currently, to what extent it can be described as anarchist, and its current and future challenges. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe.